Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Molly Clark. I'm the Senior Director of Operational Analytics with the Northridge Group, and happy to have you all here with us today. Before we get in and get into our content for today and our discussion, I want to just take care of a couple housekeeping items for all of you. So during today's webinar, during our discussion, we are going to be checking in and seeing if folks have questions, comments, kind of want to contribute into the discussion. So we will be checking for questions. If you do have a question, feel free to use the option to submit a private question. So we will not have any audio from our audience members and participants today, but we will be looking at questions. So feel free to do that. We will do our best to go in and take a look at all those questions throughout the session today. Anything that we don't get to, though, we will be answering and being sure to follow up after today's webinar. We also will be distributing the presentation after the webinar today, so you'll have all the content that, that we are walking through. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and get us started. So again, I'm Molly Clark, Senior Director of Operational Analytics with the Northridge Group. I will be moderating our discussion today with our two excellent presenters. And our first is Leo Lanzillo, who is the Chief Financial Officer for the Northridge Group. And then we also have Steve Stoute, who's the Vice President of Strategic Initiatives with DePaul University. So before we jump in to our discussion today, I'm going to let each one of our presenters introduce themselves. So Leo, we'll go ahead and start with you.
Great. Thanks, Molly. Thanks, everyone, for joining. I've been with Northridge Group for about 20 years now and been in all kinds of different roles. And data has always been at the forefront of what we've been doing. And so I'm very interested in discussing that today with Steve and Molly, and looking forward to it. Right now, I serve as the CFO for Northridge Group, and I also oversee the strategy for Northridge Group.
Excellent. Thanks, Leo. And Steve.
Yeah, thanks, Molly. Thanks for having me. Thanks, everyone, for joining the discussion today. Steve Stoute, Vice President for Strategy and Chief of Staff here at DePaul, the largest Catholic university in the country. I've been here for 4 years. Before that, I was a lawyer in private practice. So I'm an M&A lawyer by training, but have a history and a career in higher education before law school and legal practice. I oversee our strategy, and an important part of that work is data-driven, data-informed decision-making. So hopefully we'll get some good engagement and discussion about the topic and our slides today. Thanks.
Thanks, Steve. And just get us started. So today's discussion, we heard Leo and Steve both touch on it, but this is a scenario or a problem that we've seen time and time again where we have access to excessive amounts of data, but the challenge is really how do you distill that down to get meaningful insights, actionable insights, insights that you can take and kind of run with as an organization in order to achieve those objectives. So access to data, having data available, this is a scenario that's near and dear to my heart because we run into this all the time, especially when we're looking at operational efficiencies. There's so much data available, but really what do you do with that data and how do you distill it down in a meaningful way? And today for our discussion, we're really going to be kind of tackling or looking at that problem through the lens of a scenario where the Northridge Group partnered with DePaul, with the team at DePaul in order to look at some of these data sources and the excessive amount of data and do just that. How do we distill it down? What are the right questions to ask? What are some of our assumptions about the data that were maybe confirmed or challenged when we got in and got our hands dirty and really dug into it? So for purposes of today's discussion, before we get into kind of the specific use case, Steve, I'm going to see, can you give us a little bit of just background on DePaul University and set the stage for us for prior to Northridge coming in, kind of just the scope and scale of what we're looking to do?
No, absolutely. Happy to do that. So like I said in my introduction, we're the largest Catholic university in the country, just about 21,000 students overall. We have 2 campuses here in Chicago, one downtown in the Loop and the other just north in Lincoln Park. Covers both campuses, about 41 acres. We have 10 schools and colleges within the university. On the revenue side, we have a revenue budget of about $700 million. 86 to 88% of that over the last few years comes from students, student tuition and fees. So our residence halls and technology and other fees. Each college and school of the 10 runs its own operating budget, which rolls up to the university-wide financial management system. So that's really, in a nutshell, that's the institution, operationally and financially.
And Steve, part of your role is sort of wrangling all of that data and all of that information for the correct audiences, correct?
Yes, correct. I think one of the things I've enjoyed is as part in higher education, data. You said it, Molly. Excessive data is available, and we collect it. We collect it from any number of sources. We have, I think, over 20 CRM systems in use across the institution. We would like to draw that number down, but in many ways, each system has a important and unique purpose. But pulling all that data together in one central place so that we can, to your point, distill it. We can derive practical, strategic insights from it and drive the institution and our strategy forward. That has been part of my task in my 4 years here at DePaul. Is to do that in a way that helps our board, our governing board, our board of trustees make strategic decisions for the institution.
And Leo, I'm smiling because as Steve's talking through this, I know this is something that you've seen a couple of times in your tenure at Northridge. Can you tell us a little bit about this landscape and your experience with different companies where their data looks like this?
Sure. Enterprises all over the place will have, they grow up and towers tend to form within enterprises, or they acquire new businesses. And so you end up with these silos of data. And I think in the last 10 years, it's probably gotten worse because it's so easy to get access to new systems, right? You can take out your credit card. You can sign up for a new cloud-based tool that's going to generate all kinds of data. You can sign up for a data warehouse in the cloud and store it all. And so you're going to have these pools of data that get spread across the organization, and bringing them all together to make sense out of that from an organization, the strategic point of view, organization-wide, is a real challenge that every organization faces. So.
Mm-hmm. And thinking through that lens a little bit, I do want to talk, Steve, a little bit about the landscape of data. So you mentioned that there were 20 CRM systems that you were working with at DePaul. Can you kind of talk to us a little bit about how those 20 systems came to be and then sort of efforts you went through to consolidate those?
Right, absolutely, Molly. I think before I do that, I'll just a word on what Leo just said, because that has to do with how some of these CRMs came to be. The ease of acquiring software systems and CRM, particularly cloud-based, it has added to our challenge. And many of these, and not many, but a few of our systems have a unique specific purpose, right? That is the only thing they do. An example I'll give is we use the Handshake platform through our Career Center for alumni engagement. So it is a way to connect our DePaul students to DePaul alums for mentoring, career advice, career guidance, internships, and the like. But outside of our Career Center, we don't use Handshake anywhere else. And so one of the challenges for us that I will talk about in terms of the data warehouse is taking that discrete data and incorporating it with other data sets to help provide a more holistic data view of the institution, right? And so that is one piece of it. We have systems that are useful to the institution, but useful for one unit. So this is the data silo. They're useful for one unit, for one specific purpose. Until I find it hard pressed to see a point where there are one or two CRMs that could do everything we need done at DePaul. So that day probably will not come, but I also don't think we need 20. Leo, did you have a point there?
Well, I was just going to ask, they're necessary for those units, right? You allow the unit to sort of procure what they need for their college or for their purpose, right?
Right.
How do you sort of keep control of that at the university-wide level, or is it just a little bit of the Wild West out there?
I would like to think it's a little less than the Wild West, but to say we have control over it would be inaccurate. I think we've encouraged leaders of units and deans of our schools and colleges to think first about what we have available to us, and are we using the full breadth, the full scope of what the systems we have available to us? Are there add-ons as our external vendors and providers continue to build out their platforms? Are there add-ons that we don't have access to that can deliver what you need before to use your phrase, Leo, before you whip out the credit card and just buy another system? Can we use what we have access to already to help you accomplish your unique unit, school, college goals? But the data silos become a real issue. And so for us, we've been blessed to have IRMA, the Office of Institutional Research and Market Analytics, as our data warehouse. That's something that has been longstanding here at DePaul. We take great pride on our ability to use data and use it effectively to drive our strategy. One of the things we did in my time here at DePaul is restructure the organization and move IRMA in terms of where that unit reported. So historically, we inherited an organization where IRMA reported up in enrollment management. Obviously, as a university, enrollment is the thing that makes us tick. It is the thing. Our students are the people who drive the bottom line. So it made sense in many ways that our institutional research arm spent most of their time, energy, resources, efforts on enrollment management. But we learned very early on that created more of these silos where other units who could benefit from strategic, intentional data analysis and data-informed decision-making did not have the appropriate access to IRMA and those resources. And so essentially the units built their own. So they weren't getting the attention they needed from IRMA, so they built their own internally. And that is some of the problem that hampered us from having a full picture of the institutional data and how it could help us drive institutional strategy. And I think that's where Northridge Group came in so that we could have some conversations around how do we take all of this data that we have, right, and distill it in a way that is strategic and helps the board have a very clear top-down view of how we are making progress on our strategic goals.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's like my role as both CFO and CIO. That's a nightmare on both fronts, right? You got IT systems springing up all over the place, and the expense that goes with that, it's just hard to control. I think DePaul's done an amazing job of bringing that all together and getting it into one place and sort of enforcing the rules around conforming to these standards and collecting it all in a central place where everyone can use it.
Yeah, Leo, I was going to say, I think that data hygiene, data management, having systems of governance around your data is a piece that tends to be, from our experience, tends to be an afterthought. So the fact that DePaul was looking at this and saying we need to centralize the data and create some of these standards is incredibly important. And Leo, you touched on something that I was hoping you could dig into a little bit more. I think this concept of sort of, I don't know if I have it, so I'll build my own solution or I'll build my own platform or whatever it is I need to get to that data. I think there are some residual impacts around the cost associated with that for a business when they have all these disparate data sets. Can you talk a little bit more about sort of the unintended consequences of building your own, or rather not understanding what your full landscape looks like?
Well, besides the dollar cost of doing that, it's the process cost and the workload that then gets sort of driven to make sense of all that data, to keep security on all that data, and then to be able to answer questions across different units in an apples to apples comparison, right? Different organizations are tracking data different ways. Being able to make an apples to apples comparison gets more and more difficult until you're able to sort of centralize it and normalize it and make sort of fair comparisons across the units. There's a lot of man effort that gets tossed into trying to do that. And that's just a huge waste of resources, really.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And so, Steve, the well-intentioned groups, if they want to build their own, and you said part of that is access to their data, to their own data, to make their informed strategic decisions. So I do kind of want to switch gears a little bit here and talk about those strategic priorities, specifically for DePaul. What are the strategic initiatives that we're looking for that data to help inform?
No, thanks, Molly. I think for us, we have, and when I started at DePaul, we just launched a new 6-year strategic plan. And so for us, there are 6 pillars to that plan. And the 2 that really come to bear here are student success and financials. Right, again, we're a university. We are about students. The students are at the heart of our mission, the students and their success. And understanding how student success ties directly to financial sustainability of the institution is something we inherently knew, but what we needed in this process was to be more direct, tie more directly our initiatives, our investments, our resources deployed to foster and drive student success to financial outcomes, financial metrics. So we, inherently, we know, let's say, right, 20,000 students, 15,000 undergrads. It is a very simple calculation. If we retain more of them from year to year, and therefore we will generate more revenue. So if our retention rate is 80%, then we move that to 85%, or we have a goal of 90%. We know what the financial consequences are of those decisions, of those goals. What we did not understand and needed to get a better grasp of was what specifically will we do to drive that student success and increase retention? What resources do we need to invest? And what are the specific outcomes of those investments? Really, return on investment was one of the big questions our board asked us. We're investing all these additional resources in this strategy, in this plan. How will you, the administration, what are the proof points? How will you show that you spent $1 million here? Here's exactly how you better serve students, because more of them are retained, more of them graduate on time, and here is the then knock-on effect on the bottom line of our financial statements. So that was the question, really where it started from the board, the task. The board doesn't really ask too many questions. The direction was how do we better understand the return on investment of our strategic dollars?
I think what's great. Oh, go ahead, Leo.
I was just going to say that this chart really, these strategic, I love how it's webbed together, right? They're all linked together and they all feed off of each other. And it does get difficult to distinguish one specific initiative or one specific action because they're also interrelated. They do layer on each other in order to drive to the outcome. So peeling that back is a difficult challenge.
Yeah, absolutely.
Speaking of difficult challenges. I'm going to jump to the initial dashboard. So, Steve, can you talk to us a little bit about the visuals we're looking at here? You said the board's not asking questions, but what they want to know, or what are those proof points of where those investments are going? And this is the output that originally you were working with to just have that discussion with the board.
Right. Yeah. So this is one of them. And as I kind of prepare to transition away from DePaul and into my new role, one of the things I'm perhaps most proud of, and that probably says a lot about me and how I think, is we've been able to move from what I inherited, which is a set of 80 metrics that looked at our strategy across the institution, a set of 80 metrics. It's hard to even call them KPIs, because when you get to the number 80, you haven't really made decisions about what's really key and what's important. But we had a set of 80 metrics, and it was very clear to me early on in my conversations with our board leadership when I joined DePaul that was not effective for the board to perform their fiduciary responsibilities for the institution. How do we, yes, we're a large, complex institution. How do we take all that data and move away from 80 to some manageable set of KPIs that still provides a holistic picture of the institution, but hones in on what are really key performance indicators? So we went from 80 to this view, which, granted, much simpler. But even this, and when the trustees started to engage with this dashboard, the feedback we received from them was very helpful in moving the step beyond, which is this, for a quick view, this is helpful, right? You see a red arrow, you know that's not good. You see a green arrow, good, a gray arrow, neutral, and those types of things. But it was not, this still did not provide a clear enough picture for the trustees on investment, initiative, outcome, financial outcome. Mm-hmm. In that very simple description, how do we get there? How do we take all that we know, all the data that we collect across the institution to paint a very clear picture about where we are spending money, why we're spending money there, and what are the specific outcomes as it relates to student success, and then the additional financial benefit. So one example I'll give really quickly is specific to student retention. So we know what our retention rate is. Retention in this case is the number of freshmen who come back for their sophomore year. We know what that rate is. We know what our goals are. But what we were able to do when we start to pull all the data together and analyze it objectively and strategically, we're able to parse the data to see within the student retention rate, there are subpopulations of students who are underperforming their peers, well below average. It so happened, the data told us that these subpopulations were historically underrepresented students. A core element of our mission at DePaul is providing access and opportunity for students who have historically been excluded from higher education. So that goes to the heart of our mission. It is irrelevant that our 80%, and I'm just using an example, it's higher than that, but our 80% retention rate is significantly better than the national average for private Catholic institutions. That is irrelevant. What is relevant to us is that our historically underrepresented students of color, first-generation students who are low income, the proxy for that is Pell eligible, they are retained at lower than the average. So that's one conclusion. That's where we decide, here's where we invest in retention initiatives. Retention across the board will benefit, but in particular, we want to invest in resources and in programs and in supports to address the lower retention of historically underrepresented students. Here, if and we can say to the board, if we spend $1 million here, we project to increase the retention rate for those subpopulations by 10% in 2 years. The ultimate impact on our overall retention rate is 2.5%. Here's what that looks like on a financial basis. So that was the process we were able to work through by asking some of the questions in the dialogue with Northridge Group.
Mm-hmm. And I think that idea of the return on the investment is so interesting, because the return on the investment sort of has a dual meaning here, where the student's success is so important, and that is the return on the investment. So yes, the financials improve, but if you figure out exactly where those student populations are that require support, or where that investment makes the most sense, that investment goes to their success, which ultimately impacts the financials. So it's interesting, because the concept of kind of looking at the ROI and looking at retention, yes, it's got a financial element, but really it's about the students having the support and the framework around them in order to persist. And that leads to their success, which also leads to continued retention. So that concept of looking at that ROI piece, I guess, Leo, this is where, as our CFO, I'm interested to understand a little bit about your thought process when you started looking at these 80 metrics through that ROI lens.
Right. Yeah, these charts, these are fantastic charts for looking into some of the details, but pulling out the story of, okay, where should we be spending resources so that we get the maximum value out of those resources? And it really becomes a beneficial cycle, right? Of, as you see more success and you become more efficient at that frees up more resources to invest in other areas for your students and perpetuate what really is their number one mission, right? Is to serve a broad array of students. So that's taking those charts and distilling them down was part of the iterative work that Steve and our team, we went through. And Steve had a great data analytics team working with him. And so we could ask questions, and Steve could sort of turn to his data analytics team and get a whole bunch of data back, and then we could sort of work with him to figure out the so what from that data.
So can you talk to us a little bit about the types of questions that you were asking, kind of how you went about narrowing down that scope?
Sure. We started with, when Steve first showed us the charts and talked about return, it was at a university-wide level. And so first question was could we get at sort of college level data? And then within the college level data, could we break it down to what is that college contributing to the overhead of the university, to the shared expenses of the university, and breaking out the direct costs from the indirect cost. And Steve, I think that was sort of a different way of looking at it. The board hadn't gone to that level of detail before. I think that's something that was helpful for them.
Absolutely. I think we had the data. We've always had the data. But to the point I think Molly raised very early on, it's how do you distill it? How do you clear away some of the noise to focus on what's really important? And the question of indirect and direct expenses is, it's a prickly one in higher education. And so I assume there's something analogous in the corporate world. But it is tricky to assign costs to a unit that they don't have control over, but will somehow impact the metrics by which they are judged as to whether or not they're contributing to the institution's bottom line and the institution's mission.
Mm-hmm. I do want to jump to this visual, and Leo, kind of have you talk us through this piece too. Some of that visibility, I believe here is where you were able to break down for the specific colleges, kind of giving this lens, looking at margins for each one. Can you talk through that a little?
Yeah, so the top chart is where if they look at a kind of a bottom line for that university, including all of the expenses, both direct and indirect, that represents the colleges there. And some obviously are doing quite well, covering lots of expenses and then some. But then if you peel it back and you get rid of the overhead allocation, you can see what we refer to as the contribution margin at the college level. And so then linking that to what is the net revenue per student. DePaul's, I think, in a fortunate position where they can offer aid to a number of their students. And so what is the net revenue from student after aid? And being able to tie that back to how does that impact the contribution margin at the individual college and what that then means for the university.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things here, even without all the numbers that go with the charts, if you just look at the third bar from the right, you can see what that analysis looks like, going from when all in, when everything is baked in, direct and indirect, look at what the operating margin looks like. But when we look only at what that unit is responsible for, you see a very different picture. So that what that allowed us to do is have a conversation internally with the senior leadership, but then with the board about where there are areas of opportunity within the institution. So stepping back from our institutional strategy, where there are areas of opportunity to affect that contribution of that specific unit. I think in corporate context, sometimes within the same entity, you will have products, you'll have units that are leaders. They're your cash cows. They will always be that way for whatever reason. You'll have laggards. And that's an acceptable part of the mix, right? The product mix that makes for a large, complex entity. But you need very different things to support them. And so this process and asking those questions about direct and indirect, and can we separate them? And some of the other questions we asked Leo, that's where we were able to really figure out how to pinpoint areas of opportunity across the institution.
Yep, and like in any corporation, where you see units that are performing well, you can more resources spent there is a good investment and can generate further return that can then free up additional resources, generate additional resources to help out units that aren't doing quite as well. So driving more enrollments is a big factor for some schools, whereas other schools you want to sort of focus more on some of the expense side and look at that where the enrollment isn't such a lever for them.
And along those lines, Steve, you mentioned, as in any business, you have areas that are incredibly profitable, your cash cows, and then you have some laggards. Based on this exercise, kind of digging into the data and separating it out into these views, were you surprised by any of the findings, or did everything kind of reinforce sort of the gut sense of where there was opportunity? Kind of how did the data change your perception about the reality of what was happening?
No, that's a good question, Molly, and it's both and, right? So there, in some instances, the data confirmed what we knew intuitively about certain units within the institution. And in some other instances, we were surprised by what we found, and that allowed us to ask more questions, to challenge some of our assumptions, and in some cases recalibrate, redistribute some of our investments, some of our resource allocations, because what we assumed to be the case was not actually true in terms of even some of the the units that are high performing, right? There's a strong brand associated with those units on a surface level. The enrollment, if we just think about enrollment, the enrollment numbers look stable, they look secure, but when we start to drill down, some of that data suggested that perhaps that's not the case. An additional investment there would not yield the results we would expect, and would perhaps underperform. So we needed to think twice about how we then move forward supporting growth. Because as the chart, particularly the NTR per student shows, they're not all created equal. So an investment in one area may yield, to your point, Molly, greater return for the institution, but also likely position that student for greater success as well.
Mm-hmm. I always find that to be interesting in the work that we do. We're always looking at large sets of data, and we're always talking to different areas of operations where they believe in their gut, they know where the opportunities are and where they're really doing well. And I think that that's why the data is so critical, because at any given point, they're right about certain pieces. And then there are certain pieces where woefully off track, but it's hard to know exactly which ones those are until you can get into the data. Not suggesting, Steve, that you were woefully off track. These are other folks that are talking about.
I don't mind, Molly. I think, if you don't mind, the one thing I'll say is
yes.
part of this process, I think, and credit to Leo and the NRG team, some of the benefit we derive from it started with a healthy dose of humility. In that, if you are too wedded to, I know my data, I know what this will tell me, I know the outcomes. If that is the approach, it's really difficult to go through this type of exercise with a neutral, independent third party, because a critically important part to it is asking questions and challenging those sometimes long-held assumptions about what's working and what's not working. So one of the precursors to getting this right, and I hope my board would say that we have gotten it right, at least in this stage of the process, is some humility in terms of what can we learn, how can we grow, how can we be better with this process.
Absolutely. And from my experience, I've heard time and again when pushed on, why do we do it this way? Or why are we looking at it like this? There's often, well, that's how we've always done it, or that's just the strategy. But if it truly is the right strategy, the data gives you evidence to support that strategy. So there's a win-win there, because you're able to really sleep comfortably at night saying, this is the way we've done it, and we've been doing it the right way because the data supports it. And then, Steve, to your point, having the humility to take the risk that maybe we're not doing it the right way, and the data will help us understand and frame that up. So I know go ahead, Leo.
I just want to comment. It's a very iterative process, right? I mean, you start with one question, you just keep peeling back the onion, and it's, kudos to Steve and his team for being willing to we kept asking, and they kept going back to look at stuff and pull out more and more data, and then work with us to sort of get the insight from that data. It really is it can be a very iterative process, and you need a little bit of patience to work through that.
Absolutely. I do want to open it up and make sure we're addressing any questions that we're getting. But before we do, Steve, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. You mentioned that you were moving on from DePaul into a new role, and I'll let you kind of introduce your new role. But I did want to ask you, based on this exercise and kind of getting into the data here and getting into these different sort of viewpoints of your data, is there anything that you're going to take with you, any of these learns that you're going to take with you in your new role?
Yeah, thanks so much, Molly. So after 4 years at DePaul, I am moving on to be president of Canisius College in Buffalo, New York, and very much looking forward to that opportunity to lead that institution. It is obviously a very trying and challenging time for higher education, but within that, there are opportunities for institutions to continue to serve students in new and innovative and creative ways. So I'm looking forward to that, and certainly my experience at DePaul has prepared me well, I think, to lead Canisius into the future. One of the things I think I learned from this process is the challenge. If I didn't already know from my legal background, challenge everything, assume nothing. Right. I think one of the assumptions we came into, at least I came to DePaul with, is we have this robust data available to us, and we need to rely on it. Yes, in some ways, but I think Leo talked about this earlier, or touched on it earlier. Sometimes the data is gathered for a very specific purpose, and so, or the first run of the data analysis was for a specific purpose, and that in essence then infuses some bias into the data because it wasn't considered for the perspective perhaps that I needed to be. So one of the things I learned through this process that I will continue to take with me is challenge, not to say that it was incorrect, but to your point, Molly, just to say, let's talk about how was it gathered? How was the data collected? Is that the best way to do it? What is it really telling us? Not what it's told us historically from this narrow perspective, but let's step back and understand what the data is telling us and how we can work with it to move the institution forward. So challenge, assume nothing, challenge everything.
I think that's an excellent approach. All right, I am going to pause here and take a look. Bear with me while I take a look at our questions. For those of you that are listening into the webinar, if you do have questions, now's a great time to throw them into the private question, and we'll take a look and we'll answer a couple to wrap up. Okay, it looks like we have a couple questions. So the first one, you didn't talk much about the underlying systems today, but more on the iterative process. How important are the systems in all of this? So Leo, I'm going to start with you on this one and talk about how important the systems are. We talked a little bit about them, but.
Yeah, I mean, certainly having all of this data and getting it aggregated into one place, that's a critical thing to have so that there's not a lot of human effort in getting at it. And so that DePaul, through their IRMA system, had done a lot of that legwork. Now, to be honest, I don't even, the underlying system itself in that data platform, that is not as important an issue in what the data analytics tools are to get at it. That's not as critical because so many of those tools can do the same thing, whether it's a Tableau or a Power BI, whatever your data visualization tool might be, it can probably pretty much do the same as many of the others. So really it is more about the process. It is more about what questions are you asking and how you're looking at that data than it is the tool that you're using.
We actually have another question that kind of piggybacks off that nicely. So he said, you've talked about the iterative process, but how do you pick that first question? So Leo, as you're talking about the questions being critical, how do you pick or narrow down that first question?
I think where DePaul started was a great place to start, right? They have these sets of strategic initiatives that they created, strategic priorities they created 6 years ago. And so how are those priorities being lived out in generating return for the university? I think that was the question they started with. It was a very general question, and we had to sort of pick that apart to get at, okay, how are these initiatives impacting that student retention? And it's then impact on enrollment, and it's then impact on the finances, and just peeling that back I think, but we started with what was basically a very general question of, how does this impact that?
Mm-hmm. And Steve, from kind of the collaborative side, any thoughts on the types of questions being asked? Was it a different approach than what you had traditionally done looking at it?
Yes, absolutely. I think starting with the very broad question from kind of based on guidance from the board was really helpful. But I really enjoyed the process of, in many ways, deriving the questions through the conversation. So we didn't have preconceived notions. We didn't have specific questions to answer. But as we worked through the data, as we had that conversation, questions became, the next question in the set became clear. And I think that's, for me, one of the benefits of working with Leo and the NRG team is when you have to explain your data to a third party, that it helps you understand it even better. Because again, we all think we know. I'm sure everyone in the audience thinks, I know my data. Okay, great, you know it. Now go through the process of talking through it, explaining it to someone independent, someone outside of your organization. That will help you pick up cues on, well, perhaps I don't know it as well as I think I do, or perhaps there's a gap here, or I can explain it better. So that was a part of the process that I really enjoyed, is going through the iterative process and developing new questions around kind of what's the next step, how do we best help the board ultimately fulfill their fiduciary obligations, helped me learn how to ask then questions of the team. And Leo said it earlier, but I'm really spoiled here at DePaul because the institutional research team is fantastic and well-resourced. And so it was easy to go back to them with, here are the new set of questions. What data do we have? How can we unpack? How can we answer these questions? And bear with me, be patient, because I'll come back to you in a week with another set of questions. But that's really how it worked, and the team was incredibly responsive, which led to some of the good outcomes for us.
And we did confirm a lot of what you had thought, right? It wasn't all brand new revelations, right? I mean, we did maybe unveil a few different ways of looking at things, but I think it's also it was beneficial to get a lot of things confirmed. Like Molly said earlier, you can sleep easier knowing you have data to support what had always been your intuition.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Leo, and thank you, Steve. I appreciate you being on today, talking us through everything. And thank you to everyone who joined to listen to the webinar. We appreciate all of your questions and your curiosity. We will be sharing the presentation out for everybody who was able to join today, so be on the lookout for that. And thank you, everyone, for jumping on, and I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your day today. So appreciate it.
Thanks so much, Molly.
Thanks,
Leo.
Steve.
Thanks, Leo. Thanks, Steve.